For us who are military connected, it's important to remain engaged and advocate because our leaders are the ones making the decisions about where our spouses are going, where our spouses are being engaged in. And we all know the sacrifice that comes with service. However, we do still have the ability to share with our decision makers and other stakeholders that this is how this affects my family. This is how high ops tempo affects my family. This is how deployment extensions affect my family.
Welcome to More Than a Mill Spouse, the podcast for military spouses who want to live with more meaning and less overwhelm. I'm your host, Christine, seasoned military spouse, mom of 3, life coach, and your guide to intentionally designing a life you're excited about as a military spouse. I'm here to help you get the clarity you need so you can get unstuck and unlock your purpose and potential. Because you, my friend, are more than a mill spouse. You have something valuable to offer. And when you pursue the things that light your heart on fire, you trade frustration for fulfillment and isolation for a life of impact. It's time to discover who you are meant to be, because together we can change the world. Probably the last thought you have when you PCS is, am I registered to vote? In fact, perhaps the only time you think about this question is right before an election, when it's too late to request an absentee ballot. But while it may not seem like your vote really matters, today's guest is here to talk with us about why it is important for military families and especially military spouses to vote and advocate for issues impacting our quality of life. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I have one question for you. Have you listened to more than a couple episodes of the podcast? This show is made possible by listeners like you. And the number one thing you can do to support this show is by leaving a review on Apple Podcast. I know I mentioned this a lot, but the nature of podcasting is that shows that get shared and reviewed get more support, more eyeballs, and more advertising dollars. So if you believe in empowering military spouses, and if you want shows like this to continue, support the show by leaving a rating and review. It costs you nothing but a couple minutes of your time, and it makes a huge difference to me. So thank you for listening, for leaving a review, for posting to your stories, and for sharing this podcast with people in your life. All right, today's guest is Alexis McDonald. She is an advocate, military spouse, and public service professional. As the spouse of a Navy sailor and the daughter of immigrants, she has firsthand experience of the unique challenges faced by military families and underserved communities. She works as a government relations specialist with Secure Families Initiative, a nonpartisan group of military spouses whose mission is to mobilize military-connected individuals to vote and advocate for their communities, especially on issues of foreign policy and national security. So Alexis, welcome to the show. I'd love to start today by just letting you tell a little bit about your story and how you came to become an advocate for military families.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that amazing welcome. And I'm really happy to be here today talking to your viewers and your listeners. And so just a little bit about me. I am what you call a unseasoned military spouse. So my spouse has only been serving about 6 years. And we're originally from New York, but stationed at Naval Station Norfolk right now. And I think for me, I've always had a passion for helping people, and I kind of stumbled into the public service government professional role, um, originally wanting to be an attorney, but then the government bug bit me and I realized people don't understand. People are not being provided clear and concise explanations of how government can work for them and how it is supposed to work for them. And I kind of just started there and took off running. But I think where I really became an advocate was during the pandemic, and I took over as an FRG president for an FRG that was struggling a little bit, and learned, how to uplift issues for military families that way, uplifting that military families were not always getting up to date and timely information during the pandemic, especially as it differed by command. And so I kind of found a way to keep us all connected and providing information on local resources as well as DoD resources during that time for our FRG. And that's really kind of how I became an advocate. I was grateful to learn of SFI in 2020 and joined their voter focus groups talking about the issues that military spouses face when they're voting, how we can get over those hurdles, and the resources that are available to make voting more accessible and more easier for military families.
I love it. And I just want to say no matter how long you have been a military spouse, you have something to offer the community. So whether you are a seasoned military spouse or you're brand new to this
Yes.
community, we are all welcome and we all have something that we bring to the table. And you are such an example of this. And I'm excited to dig into this topic of voting as a military spouse. Now, we know that this is a major election year, and
Yes.
sometimes all we want to do is tune out all of the politics and what's going on. But can you just start by laying the foundation for why it's important to be engaged in the process?
So, I would just like to start off saying that whether your spouse is active duty, whether they are reserve, whether you are active duty yourself, it is important to vote, and you do have a right to vote. That's your guaranteed constitutional right. But for us who are military connected, it's important to remain engaged and advocate because our leaders are the ones making the decisions about where our spouses are going, where our spouses are being engaged in. And we all know the sacrifice that comes with service. However, we do still have the ability to share with our decision makers and other stakeholders, that this is how this affects my family. This is how high ops tempo affects my family. This is how deployment extensions affect my family. And also, this is how, fill in the blank, this is how global relations now affect my family. And so that's why it's so important to vote and to remain engaged. And I know that we can all become bogged down with the news sometimes. We can get bogged down with the partisan politics that happens in Washington, but we have to hold on to the fact that our stories matter. We are the experts at how those experiences that we have trickle down from the decisions made in Washington and at DoD. And so that's why it's so important to vote, especially if you are voting for the issues that are going to affect you on a daily basis at the local level. It's not just the federal level for us military connected folks. We should also be voting at the state and local levels as well.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I was one of these people that was very excited about being engaged when I was young. When I turned 18, I was like, let me go register to vote. And I know not everybody is that excited. I majored in political science, and for
Same.
the first few years of being a military spouse, I was really, really engaged in what's going on locally. How can I get involved where I'm living? How can I understand what's going on? And the longer that I have been a military spouse and the more times I've moved, the easier it is to disengage from that process and to feel like it's a lot of effort to get involved, to understand those issues. And so I know I'm probably not the only one that has experienced this, but can you kind of unpack some of the challenges that military spouses face when it comes to staying engaged in what's going on, especially at the local and state level when you're only going to be at a place for a certain number of years?
Yes. So that is a great question. And there are so many hurdles, so many challenges that we face when getting engaged. One, when we PCS, voter registration is probably the last thing on your mind, right? You're worried about finding schools, finding medical care, finding childcare. And so, one way to make that easier, registering to vote, is by using the federal postcard application. And that's also known as the FPCA. And you can register to vote and keep your registration updated that way. And why that's important is it flags you as a military absentee voter. So it provides you with certain protections that may not be available if you just register through your state registrar. And I just want to flag that it is very important that where you are voting also lines up with where you are paying your taxes, right? So we have residency, we have our home of record, and we also have where we're stationed, right? So I just want to put that out there for everyone that it's really important that those two things line up. But some of the other hurdles that we can face other than, maybe not knowing where to get your ballot, not knowing how to register is trying when you're trying to get engaged at the state and local level, you may not know where to start, right? And so y- one of the things that you can do is, reach out to your state board of elections and and see if there are, some nonpartisan opportunities, whether it's being a poll greeter or, being a nonpartisan watcher. So just helping and making sure that there are no issues for those folks who were voting. Um, but every state differs on how you can get involved at the state level. Um, there are I'd also encourage our listeners to get involved maybe with your local school board, attend school board meetings. And even if, just to know what's going on that way. I know a lot of us have kids. If you don't have kids, often your city or local government, those meetings are typically open to the public. So even if you're just hopping on Google and say, I live in Virginia Beach, I would just Google and say, hey, Virginia Beach City Council, what are they doing today? Um, and so I'll encourage our listeners that way to look for those opportunities where you can be nonpartisan and still advocate and get involved. There's also many nonprofit organizations that do advocacy work, like Secure Families Initiative. That's one place to start with getting engaged. And we have members in all 50 states. And so we are always looking for ways to help spouses get engaged as well. I hope I'm unpacking that in a way that's digestible.
I think it's really good to be able to look at not just we know this can be challenging, but there are things that we can
Yes.
do to engage in the process.
And I'll just add too, another way to get engaged is writing and calling your elected officials. And so we do a lot of that at SFI, and our advocacy is reaching out to members of Congress, reaching out to state lawmakers, and even local lawmakers when it applies to the situation. And saying these are our experiences. Just last year, Secure Families Initiative had a Hill Day up in Washington, D.C., and we were talking with lawmakers about how the strategic competition between the United States and China trickles down and affects military spouses, with high op tempos. There's also, we're seeing extended deployments. I know there's an aircraft carrier strike group that is out there, has been deployed since October and, just was extended again. And so when we bring our experiences to lawmakers, we're telling them we're the experts here. We're the ones who are directly affected by the policies that you are creating. And so that is one way to stay engaged, writing and calling and telling them what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, because those don't just go to an empty inbox. I'm a former congressional staffer, and I can tell you that those concerns, those experiences, whether you're military connected or not, they do get to those elected officials and they do take those, and consider them in these policies. And if we're not being loud enough, if we are not being engaged enough, our community will not be able to uplift those concerns. And so that's why it's so important to vote and be engaged, because we are the experts.
And that's where it's wonderful to think about this from the perspective that it's not just about voting. Voting is an important right that we all have, but also we can elevate the issues that impact us, because a lot of people do not understand what this life is like, what the challenges are, what we're going through, what we're struggling with. And the more that we raise that message, we share what's going on, the more people begin to understand. And that's how change actually happens. Do you have a story or stories about advocacy that military spouses have done and the difference that it made?
Yes, I actually do. So, Secure Families Initiative last year started circulating a petition. Um, and I know most of us were aware of what was happening with Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama and his hold on military nominations for many officers. And to just give our listeners a little context around that, one senator, the way the rules of the Senate are created and how they exist, one senator can choose to block a nomination for officers at certain ranks, for flag officers, when they are before the Senate to be promoted. And so, due to a DoD policy that existed at the time, Senator Tommy Tuberville wanted to use his power to uphold, to block this nomination as a political tool to try and change a policy at DoD. And Secure Families Initiative started sounding the alarm and saying military families are being affected by this. This is affecting readiness. This is affecting retention. This is affecting employment of military spouses who were told they're going to move, have given up jobs, have given up childcare slots, and now they're in limbo. And so not only did we circulate a petition with over thousands of signatures, but we also were speaking on news outlets. We were also having members call Tommy Tuberville's office, call their elected officials saying something needs to be done. This is affecting us. This is trickling down. This is not, you know, this is not just some one-off issue. This is affecting tens and hundreds of families, um, and down to our operational readiness, it was affecting as well. The commandant of the Marine Corps had a heart attack because he was doing, the two top jobs in the Marine Corps. And so our advocacy ultimately led to that block being removed and Senator Tuberville releasing his hold. And so that is one example of advocacy in action, that when we use our collective voices, when we come together and when we keep the pressure on, policies will change and things will happen, And so advocacy is not just screaming into the void. Sometimes it can feel slow, I won't lie, but every little bit of progress makes a difference. Every voice, whether it's one, two, three, 100, 1,000, all of those voices count, all of those experiences count, and uh, all of those stories count towards moving the goal, getting over that goalpost, getting over that hurdle.
And it's powerful to think about the fact that each of us has a role to play. But when we choose to step into that role, when we choose to use our voice, it does make a difference. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way because, as you said, change, the process moves very slowly. But the one thing that will not make a difference is when we don't do anything, when we just
Exactly. We
try
can't
to ignore what's happening.
we cannot afford to sit back and say, I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to advocate. And I know that it can be intimidating at times as military spouses because we're unsure of the rules of how we can engage and how we can advocate. But also, if you still have questions after this podcast, please reach out to Secure Families Initiative, whether it's questions about getting involved, getting engaged. We're happy to point anyone in the direction and help them and make sure that every spouse, every military connected person has the tools and the confidence to advocate for themselves.
Okay, speaking of rules, I want to circle back to talking about voting for a few
Yes.
minutes. And you mentioned, we talked about, we have our residency, we have our home of record, we have where we live, and all of that can feel overwhelming when we're trying to figure out, where do I start and where do I vote? So can you unpack those a little bit for us?
Yes, of course. So the first thing you want to do, and like I said before, when you use the federal postcard application for your absentee ballot, you do get that protection as a military absentee voter. And so that guarantees you 45 days before an election that you should be receiving your absentee ballot. It also, people who are overseas and not connected to a military installation can also receive their federal their federal postcard application and apply for their absentee ballot that way as well. And so first you want to identify, where are you? And the second thing you want to do is identify, do I have access to the United States Postal Service? Because sometimes you're stationed or attached to an embassy and you don't have access to USPS. And so that's another hurdle that you have to face, trying to figure out, how to get this mail sent over, right? So typically, um, you'll have to use embassy mail to do that, depending on your duty station. But like I said before, you want to make sure that you first apply for that federal postcard application, and second, figure out, do you have access to U.S. Postal Service, or how you will get that U.S. mail to the post office. Once you apply for that federal postcard application, it will walk you through all of the steps to filling out your ballot, shipping it, and then you may even have a SFI voting ambassador on your base who can help you with that too. There are also DoD liaisons who can answer your questions about voting or where you might want to vote. And so it's a pretty fairly simple process once you're using the federal postcard application.
Okay, so how early should you be filling that out?
So you want to fill that out as soon as possible, right? So if you also want to identify, okay, if I live in New York State, right? And I pay my taxes in New York State, that is where I'm voting, right? And so I want to also make sure, okay, you want to look up those dates. When is, if you're voting in a primary, when is the primary date? If you are voting federally, okay, we all know the election's in November, but sometimes the date changes, right? So you want to go to your Board of Elections website and for state voting, but for federal voting, at least 45 days before. So that you can get your absentee ballot 45 days prior.
Okay, so when it comes to voting where you live versus voting where your state of residency is, what advice do you have there?
So, wherever you are paying your taxes is where you want to make sure that lines up, right? So, I could claim state residency in Virginia, but if I'm paying taxes in New York, I need to make sure that I'm voting in New York. And so that is really that big piece, to just, take the nuance out of it, where you are paying your taxes, where you should be voting.
That's good. All right. So let me ask you this. What's your opinion on military spouses voting in local elections? Because let's say you are stationed somewhere, but your state of residency is somewhere else. You're registered to vote somewhere else. You pay taxes somewhere else that you don't currently live. So you might not have a good sense of what is going on locally. Or let's say you're registered to vote and you pay taxes where you are currently stationed, but you're not going to be there for the long term. And so others don't like the fact that you have a say in what happens locally. And I bring this up because when I was in college, there was actually a lawsuit because college students were registering to vote and they wanted to participate in the local elections. And local long-term residents really did not like the fact that college students who may or may not stay there long-term were influencing the local elections. And eventually that lawsuit was thrown out and they said, yes, college students can vote where they reside and attend college. But that didn't change the fact that there was some tension that college students were impacting the results of local elections. So what are your thoughts on military families being involved in local elections?
So I don't necessarily have an opinion, but I do think that local government affects your daily life more than state laws and federal laws. That's where you see the quickest change, right? If a city council or a local body decides to say, okay, we're upping the price on recycling, and so now you'll pay $5 extra for recycling. That's something that affects you the next day, or whenever, when it's enacted, or that's your everyday life. And so I think it's really up to the spouse to decide, the spouse and the voters in that family to decide if they want to engage in, local government, if they want to vote in local government, especially if, everything lines up, right? If you're voting there, you're paying your taxes there, your voice should be heard. And so it's not a matter of should they or should they not. I think it's a matter of can our collective voices important enough to this local body? And I'll just raise a point that that's why it's so important for, military family representation to be on state boards. There are various states that have boards that help with military issues and issues connecting to military families. And so that's what I'll say on that.
So good. All right. So, what tools or resources can you suggest to help us become more educated voters?
So I will say on our Secure Families Initiative website, we do have a host of resources for voting, especially in this, big presidential year. And there are going to be a lot of candidates on your ballot. A lot of issues may pop up on your ballot as well. And so for anyone who's looking for somewhere to start with a friendly face or voice, you can go to securefamiliesinitiative.org and start there.
Awesome. So, I would love to know if there are specific issues affecting military families that we should be aware of so that we can become better advocates.
I think there's all, that question can branch off into so many different things, right? So, of course, we're always watching what's going on at the federal level. Um, One thing that military spouses and families can educate themselves on is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is our military budget. We actually have an amazing kind of budget basics boot camp teaching military spouses about that on our SFI page and on our YouTube channel. So definitely check that out. And the reason I mentioned the NDAA specifically is the way the NDAA works is to create the policies on how the DoD budget will be spent. And so that comes down to childcare, it comes down to funding for MTFs, it comes down to funding for mental health. It covers every dollar that is spent under the DoD umbrella. And so that is one way that spouses can, start to educate themselves and write to their elected leaders at the federal level and say, "Hey, my CDC's roof is falling in. Can we do something about that this year?" Issues like that we can bring up, issues of do you feel safe where you're PCSing? Do you feel like you have enough information about the duty station that you're being sent to? So different issues like that is how we can uh, educate ourselves and advocate.
Well, thank you so much. This has all been really helpful. And I would love for us to wrap up this conversation by just sharing a little more about Secure Families Initiative and how we can get involved.
Of course. And so Secure Families Initiative is a nonprofit that was started in 2020 by military spouses, and everyone on our staff is military spouses. And so at the heart of our advocacy are, kind of the issues that aren't really getting talked about or that military spouses are often left out of the conversations, so foreign policy, decisions over war and peace. Most recently, we have been working on the 2001 authorized use of military force and trying to repeal that. And last year, the repeal did pass the Senate, but did not pass the House of Representatives. And so, for those who may not be familiar, the 2001 AUMF was used to go into Iraq. And so that is still on. It's still an active, authorization, and has been used in the past 4 and 5 years to justify military force by the executive branch and what the presidential administration. And I bring that up because that directly affects our service members, right? Being sent out on missions or being sent to do something, but Congress hasn't authorized that, right? And so we focus on trying to give Congress back their power, their war powers. Also expanding the military vote, making sure that military voters are connected and have the tools they need to advocate for themselves and have all the information they need to vote. And so if you want to get involved with SFI, we have different leadership teams. We have our War Powers leadership team. We have our voting leadership team. We also have our brand new nuclear proliferation leadership team. And so if issues, nuclear powers and all of the things that come with nuclear interest you, please reach out. We also have a voting leadership team that focuses on issues of voting rights. And so we also have different caucuses for military families of color to get involved with. We have a Black caucus. We have a Hispanic Latino caucus. We also have an AAPI caucus. We also have a white caucus as well. And so please definitely reach out if you're interested, or if you're even just thinking about how to get involved. Please reach out to us at securefamiliesinitiative.org. And we'll be happy to get connected with you and meet you and talk with you and give you all the tools that you need to get involved in advocacy and feel your best and your strongest and your most confident.
I love it. Alexis, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking to us about how advocacy matters for military spouses and ways that we can get involved and make a difference.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Christine.
All right, guys, I am airing this episode so that you have enough time to go request that federal postcard application and get registered to vote before this year's election. Now, I know there's a lot of divisive politics happening right now, but what I want you to focus on is how you can make a difference. Whether that's voting in national elections, whether that's voting in state and local elections, or whether it's becoming an advocate for issues that impact your life and other military families' lives. Hopefully, this conversation inspired you and helped you feel empowered to know that what you do and what you advocate for does make a difference. If you are looking for a way to get involved, to better advocate for yourself and on behalf of other military families, Secure Families Initiative is a great place to get started. I will have all of the links that we talked about today listed in the show notes, so please go check those out. And remember this, you are an advocate. Whether you feel it right now or not, you are an advocate and you make a difference for yourself, for your family, and for those around you. Have an amazing week. I will be back with you again next week. Until then, may you live filled, fueled, and full of joy. Hey, amazing milspouse, before you go, I want you to know that I love hearing from you. The More Than a Milspouse community exists to help you thrive as a military spouse. Figure out what lights your heart on fire and empower you to live with purpose and impact. You can have an incredible impact simply by heading over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. But your impact doesn't stop there. You can empower those around you simply by sharing an episode with a friend or neighbor, someone who needs a little encouragement in this military life. And if this episode was meaningful to you, spread the love by taking a screenshot of this episode and tagging me on Instagram so we can continue to reach more people, change more lives, and shift the way that military spouses look at life. Because we are better together, and together we can change the world. Let's do it.